Good afternoon and welcome all. On behalf of Global Freedom of Expression at Columbia University, we are happy and deeply honored to co-host this panel regarding content moderation and free speech, along with the Meta Oversight Board and PEN America. I'd like to take a brief moment to thank all the people joining us both in person and online, and to introduce the fantastic experts that make up this panel. To my right, Susan Nozel, CEO of PEN America and fellow member of the Oversight Board, as is Catalina Botero, the Consulting Director of Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. Then we have virtually Alan Brosbridger, Editor-in-Chief of Prospect News and also a member of the Oversight Board. Michael Solenko, joining us here in person, Executive Editor of Rest of World, and virtually Preeti Nalu, Global Director of Report for the World. There's no doubt that online social platforms have introduced a radical shift in how we communicate. Public debate has followed suit and transformed swiftly, up to the point where we all are still trying to make sense of it. Concepts such as mis and disinformation, which predate the online era, have become novel again and acquired new dimensions in light of new technological developments. Evidently, in the current online informational ecosystem, there are countless reasons to protect people's right to use social networks to express themselves, communicate with each other, report atrocities, and claim support. But there are also reasons to worry. Myanmar's Rohingya genocide, the Ethiopian conflict, and Colombia's peace plebiscite in 2016 are clear examples of the pernicious effects of mis and disinformation and the role social platforms have in amplifying them. Having diagnosed the problem, it becomes necessary to think about solutions that tackle these issues while understanding the inherent tensions between freedom of expression, fostering a safe and healthy debate, protecting people against real-world harm, and yes, also protecting the integrity of democratic systems. One of the multiple solutions when it comes to content moderation is independent oversight. Precisely here is where Meta's Oversight Board becomes very relevant. The job of the board is, through the careful review of Meta's content moderation decisions in emblematic cases, to assess whether the company has acted in accordance with its policies, values, and human rights commitments. The board also has the faculty to issue recommendations to Meta so the company's interests are weighed with public interest and human rights. There are some key factors that are essential to the success of this experiment in self-regulation, such as the board's independence from Meta's commercial, political, or reputational interests. Other relevant elements that distinguish the board are the regional diversity of its members and its aperture when it comes to hearing other voices, for example, by requesting public comments before deciding on a case. Nonetheless, self-regulation, content moderation mechanisms such as the Oversight Board are not meant to be an all-encompassing solution. While independent oversight can help produce better content moderation decisions, aligned with international human rights standards, we still need other parties of this multi-stake and complex ecosystem to play their part. To a great extent, one of the most urgent things we must do is to strengthen the role of our traditional source of reliable, accurate, and authoritative information, professional journalism. And to protect professional journalism, big platforms must do their part in bringing the profits that originate from the work of journalists back to journalism. Of course, to better understand the role of journalism in this new era, we need to listen to journalists, which we're happy to say are very well represented in this panel. The challenges they are facing are similar in many ways to the challenges I have just described. Novel technologies have introduced not only new ways to tell stories, but also profound changes to the way information is accessed and disseminated, and also important transformations and challenges to their business model. Now, more than ever, we must join forces to keep holding power accountable and continue to uphold freedom of expression. We are very glad to have this discussion today among such a distinguished crowd and to host it here at Columbia University with the invaluable help of PEN America and the Oversight Board. To get this discussion started, I would like to begin by asking our first question to Suzanne, CEO of PEN America, and like I mentioned, member of Meta's Oversight Board. I would just like to remind our dear panelists to please keep the responses to 3 to 5 minutes so that we can hopefully have an exchange at the end. And one quick housekeeping issue, we would like to encourage everyone to participate in Twitter and on social media. Be sure to use the hashtag World Press Freedom Day, and you can also follow us at Columbia GFOE. With that, Suzanne, in your view, how can models like the Oversight Board work to uphold the values and ethics of journalism through its review of content moderation?
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. You know, we think about journalists in a number of respects in our work as an oversight board. And I guess a few kind of preliminary points about why I think the model that the oversight board represents is an interesting and important one when it comes to navigating digital technology and social media. It's the international representativity of our organization, where we really have perspectives from all over the world, from all sectors of society, linguistic backgrounds. And so it becomes a kind of a very different conversation than you have almost anywhere else when you're deliberating with fellow members of the board. And, you know, as we think about, I'm thinking a lot about, as I know many of us are, with AI, how are we ever going to get ahead of some of the grave challenges and quandaries? And, you know, to me, there's some aspects of the oversight board that I hope are taken into consideration, and that would be one of them. It's also the representativity in terms of backgrounds. We have journalists on the board, we have human rights activists, we have lawyers, we have academics, and, you know, those perspectives can be very different. We have, in the US context, a lot of political diversity in terms of who's on the board. And so we have some conversations that honestly, I think we're not really having almost anywhere else in this country that we have in some of the board deliberations, and they're difficult between sort of more progressive and more conservative board members. And so I think trying to foster, as we navigate novel technologies, that kind of interchange where you really have a breadth of views at the table, participating as equals. You know, we have the ability to deliberate confidentially before we put out our decisions, but we also engage with all kinds of different stakeholders. We have a terrific staff that puts together groups of people and experts from all over the world to give us input into these decisions, to bring to bear different, whether it's ethnic or cultural or religious or linguistic considerations, so that our deliberations are informed by all of that. So, you know, to me, I think there's some central elements of this model that are important, not just in terms of the equities of journalists on a platform like Meta's, but even more broadly. You know, when it comes to journalism more specifically, it comes up in a lot of ways. I mean, one of the most sort of thorny aspects of content moderation is the question of this newsworthiness allowance, and it's basically it's an exception to just about all of most of Meta's content moderation rules in terms of what's prohibited from being posted on the platform. If content is judged sufficiently newsworthy, that can triumph over those prohibitions. And I think that goes to an instinct that I think you have if you've grown up in a free society or anywhere, that there's a right to information, that when something is of public consequence, that where it's being debated, where it's notable, that you should be able to get access to it, you should be able to discuss it. It shouldn't be off limits. And yet it also bumps up very directly against, some of the most serious harms of social media. And the board confronted this in addressing the question of Donald Trump's presence on the platform. Is this amplification of threats to democracy, of hateful speech, or is this newsworthy because we're dealing with the president of the United States? And that ended up, if you read the Trump decision, being a very kind of careful line that the board had to draw. And it comes up in other cases. We've had cases, in Ethiopia where people are giving a warning about potential violence, but that warning is unsubstantiated. You can't validate in real time whether the attacks are actually taking place, or it's, on the other hand, perhaps an effort to stoke retaliation and to foster and incite violence. And so some of that line drawing is very difficult. And it's extremely helpful to have journalists on the platform who can let us know and take into consideration how media outlets would deal with the question. We're dealing with a case right now that has to do with images of prisoners of war, which is an issue that media outlets have had to deal with extensively. It's not, I don't think the considerations for a platform like Meta are identical to those of a news outlet, but the expertise and the perspective is relevant.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. And to complement that view, I would like to ask Alan, from his double capacity as a Meta Oversight Board member and editor, how do you see the role of journalism evolving in the age of social media and the internet?
Well, hello and greetings from London. I'm speaking a few hundred yards from Buckingham Palace, so we're all rejoicing. But I'm also speaking on World Press Day, and this is a day for sober reflection as well as celebration of what journalists do. This question of journalism and how its relationship with social media is one that journalists have been struggling with, I think, for about 15 years, ever since social media really became a mainstream thing. And I think to this day, a lot of journalists can't really decide what they think about social media. As a sweeping generalization, I think most journalists are instinctively hostile to the idea of social media, especially older journalists who grew up in an age where they had an effective monopoly on the dissemination of information, and suddenly hundreds of thousands and then ultimately hundreds of millions of people barged in and also had the capacity to publish and discuss and debate. And you can understand, I suppose, the human reaction in journalists who just felt that this was nothing to do with what they did, and signified a terrible and alarming development in the world of information. And of course, they're not entirely wrong. There are people who can only take one view of social media, that it's a plague on society and that it's full of chaotic information, disinformation, misinformation, fake news. And that is one story about social media. But I always felt that the story about social media was more complicated, more interesting than that. And the journalists who interested me most when I was editing The Guardian during that period were the journalists who felt that this was a really interesting thing, even before we were clear, and maybe we're still not clear exactly what to call it. But we're interested in working with it rather than sitting and staring at it. Most obviously, it's an amazing tool for reporting. It's just formidable as a way of crowdsourcing stories, crowdsourcing problems, of finding experts, tracking down witnesses, calling out for experiences. There's never been anything like it, obviously, in the world, and I think the brightest reporters use it in that way. It's an extraordinary place of discussion and debate for journalists who want to. Again, there are some journalists who are rooted in the age of one-way transmission, which was effectively what a newspaper was or a broadcast studio was. You sent out your news into the world, and you weren't really interested in what came back. I now feel a piece of journalism is incomplete unless I can see the reaction to it and take part in the discussion about it. So it's a tremendous place of engagement. It's really interesting seeing journalists using it as a place to amplify their work, in some cases to simplify their work. I think it's really interesting to see journalists who have written 3,000 or 4,000 word pieces that they know not many people are maybe likely to read, but then break it down into a thread of 10 tweets because they're interested in drawing people into into their work or finding ways of engaging with audiences. And these are huge audiences, remember, far larger than most news organizations can ever hope to be. And that's a very different idea from this one-way broadcasting of news. I think the best journalists are open to challenge, even correction. And I think all this leads to better journalism and more trust. I find it very interesting that what I think of as the techniques of trust that non-journalists on social media, how they have to win their trust. They can't just say, I work for this organization or that organization, and therefore you need to trust me. They have to show their workings. They have to show their links. They have to show their evidence. They have to show screenshots of what they're writing on. They engage with their audiences. Of course, if they get something wrong, they correct or clarify what it is, because otherwise people are unlikely to trust you in future. And lots of journalists actually quite resistant to those kinds of ways of behavior that feel intrinsic in 2023. And finally, I just think that it's important that professional journalists are present in these spaces, because I think the alternative, which I know some of my colleagues do, which is to feel they don't want to be there, they want to ignore it, they refuse to dignify it with their presence, they want to wall themselves off into a different space that they call professional journalism, as opposed to this amorphous mass of information in order to not taint themselves with it. I think that's a mistake. I think for all the reasons and all the potential that I've outlined so far, I think the combination of journalism and social media is immensely powerful. And it also goes without saying that journalism itself has to operate to the highest professional and ethical standards. We've seen a story recently about Fox, America's most successful cable channel, and the really distressingly bad standards of behavior that became apparent during their engagement in a legal action with Dominion Computers. So, in short, I think this is an unfinished story, but I tend to think that the potential of social media is such that it's really important that journalism is in that space, is learning about new techniques of trust and new ways of engagement and reporting. And that will make journalism better, and it will also make the social media spaces themselves better.
Thank you, Alan, for those very interesting insights. I would now like to turn it over to focus on how journalism sees this role, especially given the global context. Michael, you're the executive editor of Rest of World, which is dedicated to covering the impact of technology outside the West. How does Rest of World approach content moderation and fact-checking in countries with different standards for press freedom and free speech?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I think this is a really interesting question, an important one. So I've been in tech journalism for around 10 years, 11 years, and since that time, content moderation has been a hot topic. I think one thing that we learned certainly in the American context, but especially in the global context, is ultimately moderation comes down to resources, intent, and understanding the systems, right? Based on expansive reporting in the US, we know that content moderation is often undervalued in these large platforms. There's not enough resources going towards it. That problem is exacerbated abroad. I can talk about multiple examples of situations where moderation decisions are opaque, never explained, under-resourced. There are markets where there just aren't enough moderators who speak the language who can make moderation decisions appropriately. I'll share a small anecdote around Ukraine. I met a publisher of a Ukrainian outlet who was, they published a number of articles that cited Azov, as in the Azov battalion. Azov was a word that was flagged within Facebook system, so the pages were taken down. They were prevented from publishing. When that publisher then sought someone at Facebook to help, they just couldn't figure out who it was, right? Those kinds of moderation failures are clear indications of resource shortages, right? And I want to come back to that. And so oftentimes as journalists, we're left kind of trying to reverse engineer what the moderation policies are. This isn't an important part of journalism. Is it our place as journalists to find all the faults of platforms and their failures? I'm not quite sure. And I don't know if that's the appropriate kind of balance of power. But it is a necessary one. And I'll tell one more anecdote just to kind of highlight how difficult these systems are for journalists to understand. In Sri Lanka, there was a case, the Oversight Board actually made a ruling on this recently, in which Facebook broke its own rules by allowing people to petition for drugs that were in much demand. Facebook acknowledged it broke those rules, but it did so under the spirit of policy. I think that's the terminology. And the Oversight Board agreed with that, which makes sense. But in terms of what does that mean, spirit of policy, what does that extend to? Even the Oversight Board sought clarity. And as journalists, we do too. And quickly, I'll shift to fact checking. It's a little bit of a different subject. I'll put fact checking in the context of reporting more broadly. It's getting increasingly more difficult for our reporters and journalists to report around the world. We employ about 30 to 35 people. Those challenges aren't always just from political persecution, although that's certainly part of it. There is a trickle-down effect in terms of the attitude that is expressed at the highest level, right? We're seeing people being much more litigious towards journalists, challenging journalists, which is, there's a healthy amount of challenging, but, threats. And we don't really see that getting any better unless, we really kind of take a stand as an industry in order to kind of reinforce our value and what we stand for.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now to hear more on the challenges facing journalists in this context. Preeti, given your wide experience in media and advocacy, and now as Global Director for Report for the World, can you speak to the unique challenges faced by journalists reporting in conflict zones, particularly in terms of disinformation and propaganda?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm speaking from Mexico today. And perhaps for the sake of this conversation, it would be useful to start with the general lay of the land in terms of independent media that operate in the global south, not just in conflict-riddled parts of the world, but also countries where media laws have been regressing and freedom of expression is under threat. So a lot of what I'm going to be discussing today is based on conversations with our media partners that are part of Report for the World, 32 independent public interest journalism outlets that are spread across 20 countries, so very different types of scenarios, but they're all directly impacted by the role of social media platforms with information distribution. So almost all of our newsroom partners are digital native, local and national outlets that started amid the boom of social media. And so in their early years, they benefited from easy, free access to their audiences through Facebook, Twitter, and the likes. And in a majority of the world, whether in conflict zones or whether the media is in exile or within the country of operation, we see this trend continuing where digital news is overtaking traditional media such as radio or television, simply because of the affordability of smartphones and 4G networks. So in large countries like Brazil, India, and Nigeria, where Report for the World core members live, a majority are using smartphones to access news. And so as a direct result, digital platforms, including social media, will remain a key source of distribution for newsrooms in the global south. But what's happened over the years as our newsrooms describe is that these platforms have changed or transformed how our partner newsrooms would need to produce, distribute, and even monetize their products, right? And so of course, the consumption patterns and the behavior of their early audiences that were much more engaged has also changed massively over time, especially since 2018, when Facebook announced that its algorithm would prioritize personal communication or personal conversations over news information. And since then, it seems that they have been fighting what appears to be an uphill battle where their audience engagement on these social media platforms continues to decline. This has also meant that it has created a scenario of overdependence on platforms where, unfortunately, the future of digital journalism is tied to the profitability interests of big tech. And so this also means that audience reach, it means something even more crucial, which is that audience reach and engagement for these independent media is integral to the conversation on reducing disinformation and misinformation on social media. And I'd be happy to go into the details of what our newsrooms are doing to combat this. They're actively diversifying their approaches. They're reverting to digital methods such as newsletter subscriptions, membership models, paywalls, collaborative sites, which existed well before the emergence of social media giants. And we're also seeing a lot more collaboration among media of different sizes, capacities, geographic coverage, so they may reach diverse audiences. Yet, as Alan just pointed out earlier, there's no doubt among our partners about the power of social media as a crowdsourcing tool, as described by also one of our investigative outlets in Nigeria, the Foundation for Investigative Journalism, that often uses Facebook to shed light on police violence in Nigeria. That's one of the beats that we're supporting at Report for the World. Our other partner that is much more hyperlocal, that covers a particular neighborhood of Sao Paulo in Brazil, Agência Mural, says that it is a super important way of amplifying stories through engaged younger audiences so that they may reach the demographics that, traditionally have low trust in media or news information. And so what is missing in all of this is a more engaged, active role of social media platforms in enabling users to better distinguish between content from journalism outlets and other sources of information. And on the other hand, more actively helping our news media partners to integrate tools for better audience engagement and subscribed content. And many of our media partners tell us that they're actually, I think it's something that was just mentioned earlier, they're unable to get the help that they need at the local level. They're unable to effectively measure the quality of reach when they're trying to invest in promoting their content, or when they're trying to understand why they're not able to reach certain audiences. They do not feel that they have effective partners from Meta and the likes who can work with them, at least at the local level. They feel that they often lack knowledge, they're not up to date with the changes, or they're unable to influence or remedy situations. And so there were some excellent examples earlier from Michael. These can range from technical issues to when governments are restricting content or when certain important stories are being taken down. So this has meant that local media are most vulnerable to these changes, but they're also actually the last to receive help. And so the biggest need as expressed by them is that when used as search engines, that these platforms must devise better mechanisms to quell misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you very much, Preeti, for those reflections. We now would we'll do a second round of questions to the panelists, and then we'll open up to the audience for sure. So let's try to keep it as brief as possible because I see interest in the audience. And let's start with Preeti this time. How can news organizations better support and protect journalists reporting from areas with limited press freedom? And I think you spoke a little bit to that, but if you can expand. Thank you.
Sure. And I think what I'm trying to present today is more from the point of view of the newsroom partners, because as I just mentioned, they are actively trying to engage in different ways of reaching their audiences. I think what our partners feel is that they know the ground realities, the nuances and context really well, but that they are not consulted, at least in a systematic manner, when decisions are made by different oversight mechanisms about which cases to investigate. Their expertise is something that could actually help accelerate the process for bodies like the Oversight Board. And I was happy to hear that, you know, the perspective of journalists is often taken into consideration because they're able to actually better form an idea of the common trends in misinformation and disinformation and the links between them within country contexts and across borders. And we have journalists, for example, at The Wire in India, The Cable in Nigeria, Puma Podcast in the Philippines that have reporters who are dedicated to covering disinformation and misinformation. So I wonder if there are already concerted efforts to work with such reporters on the ground at the Oversight Board and other top-down institutions, because we'd love to be able to facilitate more of that kind of engagement between our local reporters and oversight mechanisms.
And I'll make a note of that for Suzanne and Alan to maybe come back to when they're answering their questions. But for now, I would like to turn to Michael to expand on how can international journalism organizations work together to combat the spread of disinformation and misinformation online.
Sure. So I actually like Preeti's suggestion a lot, and I hope we can see some more of that. I think I'd push back politely on this question just a little bit, because it's not necessarily journalists and publishers who are disseminating, pushing disinformation, misinformation. And as such, we have a somewhat limited ability in order to stop this, right? Most of this is actually happening on large platforms over which we have minimal control, although, of course, like I said, there is a role for journalists to play in terms of identifying misinformation, disinformation, and highlighting it. Beyond that, I do think, you know, Suzanne brought up kind of the next phase of all this, which is AI. Disinformation, misinformation is getting much more easily made and much cheaper to disseminate. That is really, really alarming, right? So however bad it is now, it most certainly will get worse. And I do think there's a role for individual journalists, organizations, and consortiums of, you know, journalistic publications to voice and signal exactly who we are, what we do, to build that trust, because I think in the next 5 to 10 years, that trust is going to mean a lot, especially as consumers start to lose trust in what they're seeing on their phones day to day.
Thank you, Michael. We'll turn now to Alan, and I think this goes to exactly what has been discussed. How, thinking about this role of news organizations and social media platforms, Alan, how can these two work together to uphold the values of a free press while also combating disinformation? You're muted, Alan. We can't hear you. Thank you.
There are some things that only social media companies can do, and we on the Oversight Board can consistently press them to do it. And a lot of that's around transparency. And I think a lot of the general public want to understand better their decisions about design, their use of algorithms, their use of metrics. I think they have enormous power to help amplify the best journalism and to help the best journalism not only survive but thrive. I think a lot of people are very frustrated in the way in which the big platforms are really quite opaque and unwilling to share information about the decisions they make. So I think we should press them to be more open, and certainly on the Oversight Board we do, and I know a lot of journalistic organizations do too. I think they can collaborate with others on issues of, for instance, of free speech. I think there is a certain humility. It sounds an odd thing to say about Facebook and Meta, but the act of setting up the Oversight Board was in some way a form of humility, a realization that all the criticism they were getting really, some of it was merited, that you had a group of extremely talented engineers who had done something extraordinary. But engineers were not necessarily the best people to be thinking about these extremely difficult issues around the balance of free speech and other factors. That these are issues that have been around for hundreds of years, but are extraordinarily complicated by the scale in which it now exists. So this it's a real extension of what I was saying earlier. I think news organizations should engage with them. Of course, you've got to report them critically when things are wrong, but I can't see any point in the kind of reporting that I sometimes see in which they can see no point in social media, or there's a kind of purism, if I can put it like that, that holds its nose and doesn't want to engage or help these companies achieve anything. I mean, the reason I joined the Oversight Board is it seemed to me a lot of the issues they were wrestling with were the kind of issues that newspaper editors deal with all the time in dealing with these balances between the harms that information can cause, issues of hate speech, political speech, defending journalism against people who would try and close it down, issues about privacy, issues about uses of pictures. I mean, many of the issues that are coming up that we're deciding on are the kind of editorial issues that journalism deals with routinely. And so I think journalists can play a part in shaping these organizations, but there are some things that only these organizations can do, and they're mainly around transparency.
Thank you very much, Alan. And I will pose the last question to Suzanne. And it's generally speaking about the role of the OSB in addressing this and misinformation. And I know a lot has already been said, but if you could maybe, I think it would be interesting to bring in the challenges that were presented by Michael and Preeti into your response. And thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Just to give one recent example, we were asked by Meta to evaluate their policy on COVID misinformation. They had adopted a very aggressive kind of policing of the platform to take down disinformation that could cause imminent harm. And that was put into place during the height of the pandemic, when there were conspiracy theories and false cures and just shaky scientific falsehoods that were being promoted, and even in some cases from the highest levels of government. And the platforms, Meta, but others as well, really stepped in, and they showed that they could suppress a lot more disinformation, a lot more reliably than I think people had understood. They also amplified solid sources of information. If you searched under COVID on Facebook, you'd get the WHO and the CDC. The question they asked us, I think it was, less than a year ago, was, well, at this phase of the pandemic, are these, very firm strictures against harmful disinformation still warranted? Because the kind of most urgent phase of the crisis had passed. And so the board took a look at that and concluded they have about 80 claims that they have on a list of basically things you can't post about COVID, false ways that it's transmitted, false cures. And it's fairly narrow. It's, it's a kind of an enumerated list. That list has evolved over time. One of the quandaries that we had to deal with in the course of that advisory opinion was, something like the lab leak theory, which when it originated was widely considered to be disinformation and false. And then kind of the thinking changed, and more serious people said, no, this, may have some scientific basis and we need to interrogate. The Chinese obviously were very much engaged in trying to suppress efforts to examine and get to the bottom of whether there was any validity to the lab leak theory. Now, could the lab leak theory cause harm? Well, there was an argument that it fanned anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiment here in the United States and around the world. Is that kind of a indirect harm sort of cognizable? Should it be cognizable in this context? And the opinion that we issued ultimately said, as long as the WHO considers the pandemic to be in this emergency phase, that it would be appropriate for Meta to continue removing these claims, but that they need to evaluate actually whether these claims are harmful, and to involve people in that decision making and consider alternative opposing views. It shouldn't be those shouldn't be decisions that are made kind of simply behind closed doors. And we also asked Meta to undertake a review of how their algorithms amplify disinformation. We've all heard by now that disinformation travels further and faster on the platform than the truth. But how exactly has that worked in the context of COVID? And why is that? What is it about the way that the algorithms are set up and programmed that makes that happen? Is it possible to tamp down on those effects? So we'll be watching closely to see what comes back to us. Obviously, when you get to political disinformation, it's even a lot more fraught because political speech, in this country and internationally, is recognized as being of such high value. It's so contested. These questions of line drawing when you're talking about, how an election is conducted, or what kinds of claims can be made about a political candidate, where the boundary lies between, the kinds of negative political ads that we're used to seeing, on television and in print media. Does that equal disinformation? It casts somebody in a very negative light. It maybe stretches the truth. And so those are really difficult lines to draw. Just to come back to, a couple of the questions raised by the other panelists. I mean, one of the challenges we have as a board is our jurisdiction is limited. So say on the very important questions that Preeti raised about how Meta has changed its treatment of news outlets, and it's now much, much more difficult for news outlets to reach an audience via social media. I mean, basically what's happened is their advertising revenue has been completely drained away through the existence of social media, because people overwhelmingly get their content now online. There's no, rather than in print where you used to get those expensive classified and display ads. So that's all gone. And yet there's even a body like the Oversight Board, we have no jurisdiction over how they treat news content versus posts, about people's personal lives. And we've had a little bit of success so far in expanding our jurisdiction, but still pretty limited and circumscribed. So I think they're big questions that unfortunately we can't get to. Just to respond a little bit to your point, Michael, about sort of the role, whether the distribution of disinformation is really about journalists, I agree with you. Journalists, by and large, unless you're talking about an outlet like Fox News, are not the originators of disinformation. They can be, and we have seen, they can be vectors for disinformation. And we've done a study at Penn America where we surveyed journalists about how they deal with disinformation. What we found was that overwhelmingly, they're dealing with disinformation in their work daily, and they do not have the tools and the resources that they need. Their newsrooms have not equipped them along many dimensions to be able to navigate the sea of disinformation in which they find themselves. And it's intensifying, and with AI, it will intensify more. And so we have a big project at Penn America to try to address some of that gap and work with newsrooms to help their journalists deal with disinformation in their work.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And now we will open it up to questions. And I think there's already one over here. I wanted to remind our virtual participants that we can receive questions from you too. Just include them in the chat option in the Zoom webinar. So please feel free to ask any questions. And Gladys, over here, we have the first question. Thank you. If you can introduce yourself, thank you so much. It's coming, yeah.
My name is Ivor Shapiro, and I am the Press Freedom Scholar at the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. My question really is precisely about what Suzanne was just talking about and other panelists have referred to, which is the question of verification fundamentally, and the role that verification can play or cannot play in content moderation. Michael, Michael mentioned when he started talking about factuality, about accuracy, that he would wish to have more to say about fact checking. So I was wondering what he would want to say, whether he would like to say it, and how some member of the Oversight Board could respond to that. There've been several, last sentence, I think, there've been several references to resources. The news organizations' resources for fact-checking continue to be raised. There are, however, models where in the world, very successful models where news organizations have seen fact-checking as a sufficient priority to actually pool resources. All of Norway's largest broadsheet type news organizations, broadcast and print, have a joint project on live real-time fact-checking so to assist their newsrooms. That's one way in which this is done. Another final example would be Chequeado in Argentina and Latin America, the collaborative LATAM fact-checking organizations, which through foundation funding have prioritized providing a completely neutral and increasingly credible sense of the difference between fact and not fact in viral information online. So I just wondered, I'd love to hear Michael speak more, and then one of the Oversight Board commenting on these questions.
Thanks for that. I think what I'd say very broadly, and you brought this up too, is fact checking is very, very expensive. I think this is universally known. It takes a long time. It's very resource heavy. As organizations feel the pinch of whether it's the economy, whether it's their revenue models are changing, often it's the first thing news operations cut or make changes to. So as a nonprofit, we're lucky to have a robust fact checking system, but we also recognize that it's very unique. And I would say that I think the models that you brought up, whether it's kind of collectively bringing newsrooms together to pool resources, I think that can be really effective. I think ultimately, as we kind of enter this like new era of even more disinformation than we've already experienced, fact checking is going to be a differentiator, right? Knowing that this is a brand I can trust, this is a brand that puts in the time and the work into verifying what's on the page is really, really important. And I think you're starting to see some of that in even larger outlets. The New York Times introduced, if you read them on your phone, they introduce these little blocks like, this is how we fact check our stories. This is how we know what we know, right? Slowly messaging that to the reader, educating the reader about what fact checking is or what a fact is, how we know what we know, I think goes some way towards that.
Sure. I mean, one of the questions that we face is, when fact checking is sort of the tagging of a post to raise questions about its reliability and accuracy, the studies don't show that necessarily yields the result you would hope, which is that people are less likely to share the post or engage with the post. And so that was one of the questions we faced in the COVID PAO was, was sort of fact checking an alternative to taking these posts down when they were identified and judged to constitute disinformation that could cause imminent harm, and fact checking sort of wasn't seen as an adequate substitute. I think more research probably needs to be done, and that raises an issue that we're perennially raising in, I'd say, most of our opinions, which is there needs to be greater transparency, broader access for researchers to Meta's platforms in order to carry out that kind of research. And another dilemma we have with fact checking, like for example, the Ethiopia case that I referenced. I mean, obviously, conflict situation, crisis conditions of crisis, but really the impossibility of validating those claims and those reports that were in the post about ongoing violence, an area that was inaccessible. And time is also of the essence. That's an important thing to recognize, is that the posts on Meta's platforms have the overwhelming sort of proportion of their reach is achieved, in the first hours and days after they are posted. So if you in order for it to be fact checked, it has to be flagged. Somebody has to look at it. They have to do that work properly and carefully. And so by the time you attach that label, it could be that 99.9% of the people who are going to see that post have already seen it. And so, that is just a fundamental, sort of challenge with how far you can go in terms of tamping down on the harms by fact checking.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Alan and Preeti, would you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'll briefly add that, of course, fact checking is important. It's vital that newspapers do their bit. But Michael's right to say that it's extraordinarily expensive, and the more you tie up your reporters in doing fact checking others, that's time that they could be more profitably spent breaking stories of their own. But equally, there are some ways in which newspapers themselves have to be fact checked. I agree the problem is not mainly newspapers, and the best news organizations are rigorous, and I agree that they need to do more to explain what they're doing and how they do it. But for instance, on climate change, I can point to hundreds of examples of really sloppy, ideologically founded reporting in mainstream media. And I think it's quite understandable that a lot of young people are just switching away from that because they just think it's inaccurate and wrong. So there's a slight element of the pot and the kettle here. I think the answer is that it's at such scale, the problem is at such scale, and I know there's always a moment in these discussions, and there may be a groan in the room when I say it, but I think we all have to take individual responsibility for becoming our own fact checkers and for becoming better at spotting what's right and what's wrong and what's obviously fake. And that's going to have to begin with a program of media literacy with children. I would do it as young as 6 or 7, so that by the time they're exposed to material, we each of us can take the responsibility for checking, for being our own fact checkers, because the scale of information that is swirling around the world is so great that there's no system of fact checking or regulation that is really going to be effective against it.
If
Thank
I may
you.
just quickly add to those points, it is a bit of what Alan just pointed out, which is media literacy and sort of cultivating that the fact checking and those specialized reporting beats also within newsrooms. So we have started to support those roles of journalists who focus on fact checking and debunking misinformation so that they can work with other reporters working on, Alan just mentioned, climate change and environment and other verticals that are often misreported or ideologically motivated in the reporting. So while they're working with these journalists, they still need moderation of platforms that enable them to carry out their message with reach, to be able to reach audiences with this information when there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation. So it's only when there's concerted efforts between the platforms, the fact checkers and the disinformation focused reporters, and the reporters that are working on these verticals that we can really see a change.
Thank you, Preeti. I think there was a question over here. Yes. Let's wait for the mic. It's coming in a second. Thank you.
Sandy Colliver with the Guernica Center for International Justice and previously with Open Society Justice Initiative. Question for Suzanne. You mentioned that the Oversight Board has been able to expand your jurisdiction in small ways, not as much as you'd like. Could you elaborate how you've expanded the jurisdiction, and has there also been a conversation with the Meta executives that they've accepted that expansion? And could you also say, like, specifically where you hope to expand the jurisdiction further? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the one way, I think it's the only way, but maybe Alan will correct me if I'm wrong, that our jurisdiction has been expanded is that initially we were only empowered to look at content that had been taken down, where somebody had challenged the takedown. And now we can also look at content, where someone's challenging the platform's decision to leave content up. So that, a small sort of widening of the remit. There are a lot of areas that we're interested in delving into more deeply. Algorithmically, we can do something like in this policy advisory opinion, we can ask Meta to undertake a examination of, for example, algorithmic amplification of disinformation. But that, I would say, for us, we recognize it's sort of the algorithmic layer is the primary driver of what we all experience as the harms and pitfalls of social media. And so that the more we can plumb those depths, the more effective and impactful and consequential our work will be. There are also other areas of priority that we have identified. For example, Meta's relationship with governments. That's an area where we'd be interested in, being able to go further and examine, what that interface looks like, how exactly it works. I don't know if Alan wants to chime in.
That's a perfect answer. Nothing to add.
Thank you both. We had a question right here. Gladys.
Hi, I'm Frane Marojevic. I'm the executive director of the International Press Institute. And just one quick comment on disinformation. For us, it's also an important element in protecting journalists in terms of online safety, because one of the things that we are seeing is that the sources of disinformation are quite often the sources of attacks on journalists, and they're the ones who are pushing out, and we are producing a toolkit to help journalists investigate those sources. So that's an important element. To my question, and it's broader clearly than the remit of the Oversight Board, but I think one of the important points on platform regulation, which sometimes is not talked about, is the issue of copyright. And copyright is quite often also used as a way to take down information also coming from media and legitimate media sources. The problem with the copyright is, first of all, it doesn't come under recourse mechanisms such as your own, but also in my experience, the mechanisms for recourse on copyright are opaque, complicated, and very difficult to get any kind of response. So they present a completely, let's say, a separate avenue for those, and a very good one for those who want to restrict information by media, and it's very difficult to find a solution. So is there maybe an initiative from the board to maybe broaden their remit in that direction as well?
I mean, I think it's difficult because where the platform is legally required to take down content, that's not a decision that we review. Sometimes we do get into cases where, they may be legally required in a given jurisdiction, but it's under a very kind of dubious legal regime that may be in contravention of international human rights law. And so that may be something that we wind up examining. But, for copyright, and I know it best in the US context, it's very well established and firm kind of legal regimen. So I'm curious what kind of case you think implicates sort of free expression or press freedom equities and copyright, and maybe
Sorry, let's
that's
wait
up
for the
to you.
mic.
Oh, yeah, the mic. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, an example that I'm familiar with is an exiled Azeri TV station which was working out of Germany, and basically their content was being flagged regularly on YouTube for copyright violation. Of course, the immediate response by the platform is, we will take it down while we investigate. And since it's news content, by the time you investigate, by the time you reach conclusion, this takes
That's like a kind of harassment.
it's
a
a harassment.
law.
And
yeah,
the problem with the legal aspect is that because there is no legal body involved in any of the decisions, it's between the platform moderator and the media, but there's no lawyers, no judiciary, no, as you know, nothing involved. It becomes a very opaque process.
Sure.
I completely agree with you, and I will give at least one example. In Colombia, when the pandemic started, streaming was going on, where a small independent media outlet was doing a panel with politicians talking about the COVID pandemic. 2 minutes, 3 minutes after it started, it was blocked. And of course, all the conspiracy theories talking about COVID and all that started, and they didn't know. They later found out it was for copyright. And they were like, but it's a streaming with people. How come it's copyright? Digging a bit into it, the point was that the first lady interviewed, an important politician in Colombia, was wearing, just like you, a jacket, a bright jacket with a black, something exactly the same that she had used 1 month before in another media something. So since the first streaming was already given copyright to the other media outlet, the algorithm took that and down because of copyright infringement. And it was just this. So there are, and I agree with you, because this is a legal issue. And again, well, legal where? In the US, right? Because in many other countries, we don't have that exact strict notice and takedown system. But nobody's looking into it. And this is an example. I can give you many more, such as taking down the many, or better, monetizing many media outlet things because in Colombia at 6 a.m., everybody has to put the anthem, the Colombian anthem, and the first media outlet that has registered the first probably broadcast, I don't know, the one that was registered in this platform got the monetizing. So now whenever the anthem is sound, especially for small media outlets, is monetized for the other one. So there are many examples.
I mean, I think some of those examples might be things that we could look at, where copyright is being used and manipulated, for political motives, for example. I mean, one thing just to say to Preeti's comment earlier is, one of our challenges as a board is getting good cases. You can refer a case to the board. There's a process that's on our website. We're always in search of important, emblematic cases that can allow us to probe into pressing issues for users on the platform, for journalists and others whose speech on the platform is of special importance. So I would urge you to look at those referral mechanisms, and to, you often are the kind of the eyes and ears where you're in touch with people who are encountering these problems, and you can help us surface them and look at them. Of course, our pipeline is very, very narrow. The number of cases we can adjudicate, we're working on that. to be able to adjudicate cases in a more expedited way. But, please, through your networks, I would encourage you to surface issues and cases that you think, are spotlight areas that the board should be looking at.
We have time for one more question. Okay.
I just want to add to that. It's not only legal, I think it's also about the power dynamics between Facebook partners and the power given to them to disable content. So it's not only legal. So, and it can be anywhere in the world where, like, for example, TV stations in the MENA region, there are several examples of TV stations just disabling content because a dissident showed like a few seconds video from a TV channel, just because there is criticizing whether the government or the TV station or whatever. So the power dynamics question in Facebook between the Facebook partners in terms of monetization and Facebook, it's not only illegal. So I think this can be like a space for the board to give like recommendations towards reconsider the power dynamics of Facebook partners.
Thank you. Let's take one more last question here at the back.
Thank you. Thanks for that fascinating comment over there. I'm now worried I'm wearing the same shirt I was wearing on the live stream a couple of days ago. Let's hope not. Anyway, my name's Derek Thorne. I'm the head of the Secretariat for the Media Freedom Coalition. I was just wondering what the panel thinks of this idea that the thing that really needs oversight here is the algorithm that determines how content is rated rather than the content moderation itself. And also what they think, this seems to be the approach of the real Facebook Oversight Board, as they're called. Their first demand, according to their website, is fix the algorithm to prioritize credible news and information and to downrank hate and disinformation. So I would love to hear the members here of the Oversight Board itself, their view of the real Oversight Board, but more generally this point about algorithms and oversight of that.
Thank you. Alan, do you want to start?
Happy to. Yeah, I mean, it's a really important issue, and some people think it's the most important issue, and I wouldn't quarrel with that. I think you get limited mileage for attacking us for what we don't do. I think what we do is really valuable, and I think the need to have somebody which is not Facebook and which is not government helping to think through the extremely complex issues about the free speech of 2 billion people on the planet is an incredibly important and complicated thing to do. So I think it's what we do is incredibly valuable. What we do at the moment, we don't look at algorithmic questions, and I think it's important that Facebook are pressed to deal with that and to be more transparent about that. I think the regulation that is coming down the slipway in Europe will force them to be more open about it. And maybe only regulation can do that job in compelling them to be more forthcoming about the design choices they make. And the real Facebook Oversight Board, when they started, I took the view that the more the merrier. I mean, the more people that conduct meaningful oversight of Facebook, the better. And it's for others to judge whether they do that more meaningfully than us.
Thank you, Alan.
That was a perfect answer.
Okay, then I think we can move to final reflections from the panel and or reflections or questions for the future. And Susan, maybe we can start with you.
Look, I think Alan said it well, which is the board is, it has its limitations, but it also has some powers that really no other entity has. I mean, we can ask questions and get an answer, and as many of you have probably experienced, outside that context, that's not easy. Just to get a human being at a company like Meta to give an answer, it can be very difficult. We can make recommendations to which the company is committed to respond. They don't commit to accepting all of them, but they commit to responding to them. So, my feeling is we have to use those powers to the full extent that we can, because it's so important to hold a company like Meta accountable. And, we can use the echo chamber and the amplification of our work of areas where we need greater leeway and authority from all of you. So that's a way that I think we can collaborate. I guess my other final note is social media is changing so dramatically. I mean, we didn't talk at all on this panel about, what's happened at Twitter. I mean, Twitter, at least for, for journalists around the world, has been a mainstay, for all of the benefits that Alan and others have talked about, has been such a vital resource. And, that is, I'm not sure what will be left of Twitter, in the months and years to come. And so, it sort of forces all of us to be trying to think ahead. It took a long time to create the Oversight Board. It's taken an awfully long time to, begin to regulate social media and the ways, for example, that are happening in the European Union. So I think we need to now be thinking about what's next, about AI and, how these problems will look in their future iterations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Figuring out what's happening on Twitter is a whole day of events, I think. But I think what I would say to what I'd emphasize is, I would love to have seen someone from Facebook on this panel. I think ultimately what we're all doing here is touching, we're there's a metaphor. We're all like in a room with the lights off, touching a different part of the elephant. None of us actually understand what's happening here. We're all taking our best educated guesses. And there is no transparency around the algorithm. I'm really glad that came up. But until we actually can understand what is happening with how these decisions are made, who's making the decisions, whenever we do get insight into these processes, they're oftentimes alarming, right? They're either haphazard decisions, or they're poorly funded, or people are being exposed to horrendous content and paid poorly. Just to kind of wrap this up, I think without greater transparency, without greater funding, without greater accountability, I don't think we're going to be headed in the right direction.
Thank you. Preeti or Alan, who wants to start?
I can go. Well, I mean, just to reiterate what Michael just pointed out, but a point that stayed with me when I saw a similar panel convene in Perugia last year on the same topic, and I think it was Alan who moderated, and it was a fantastic discussion, really engaging. And I believe it was one of the speakers who's part of the Oversight Board who said we should be having parallel conversations with tech companies, but also with governments that are weaponizing or restricting information. And it made me wonder if instead of that being parallel, and maybe this is happening to some extent, thank you, Susan, for pointing out that, there is potential there to engage with governments. But instead of parallel conversations, shouldn't these conversations intersect between these different actors? And shouldn't they be led by social media giants, because they do traverse these different spaces, but shouldn't they be doing it in a much more democratic manner? And by that, I mean from the ground level with the audiences, local and national media, and freedom of expression and media development organizations more involved, and at the higher level with policymakers and government officials who are legislating how information is being distributed and who can access it in which form. I'd like to see that engagement happen at the top down and the bottom up levels. At least that's what a lot of our newsroom partners would like to see. And for those efforts to be much more systematic and concerted.
Thank you, Preeti. And Alan, we finish with you.
I think my final call out would be help us. Every single case that we do, we make a call out for people to help us think through these issues. And in nearly every case, there are people who have thought deeply about the issues that we're tackling, and who come up with extraordinarily valuable suggestions and recommendations. So please don't just think of us as a group of 26 people or whatever we are now, sitting in a darkened room. We are really trying to harness the thousands of people who are trying to make these platforms better. It's incredibly helpful to when people who I know are thinking deeply about these issues take part.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for the great dialogue that we've had here today. I would just like to remind everyone that this has been live streamed on YouTube and it will be available on our Columbia GFOE YouTube channel. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon.